And now I have a few words about our featured author. Eric Walker is a first-time author, and Lost Souls Recovered, which was published last October, is his debut novel. He's also an attorney. He's working on a second novel, an action thriller, which he'll tell you more about. He'll be speaking at the Columbus Book Festival at the Columbus Metropolitan Library on July 15th and 16th, where he'll be one of the 3 historical fiction authors discussing their book and what it takes to write historical fiction. And Lost Souls Recovered has been reviewed by several professional reviewers, one of which was Kirkus Reviews, which describes the novel as deft storytelling with superb pacing and compelling, believable dialogue. Stories that take place over decades can easily become overwhelming and unwieldy, but Walker writes tightly and expertly here, crafting an intriguing plot with a real feeling for history, an expertly told tale of loss, love, and second chances. So definitely one to check out and to hear more about. And one last thing, you can follow Eric on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok, and his username for all 3 social media platforms is, and I just blanked on how you pronounce it.
Sanaki Time.
Sanaki Time.
Right.
Very fun.
All
yeah.
Right. SENNACHIETYME, Sanaki Time.
Okay.
So that's
All right.
for Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok.
Now I'll turn it over to Eric.
Okay, and you're going to put on
Thank
screen
you. What's that?
You put on screen.
Oh, that's right. Yes, 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 yes.
I have something I want to read to you so that, well, first of all, welcome. Thank you for coming. I want to read something to you that give you a good synopsis of the book. I couldn't memorize it, so I thought we can all follow along on the screen. All right, so I'm going to read everything. There's one more paragraph below this, but I'll read it very quickly, and we could not get it on the screen. So good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this gathering at the Billingsly Public Library. Today, I have the honor of sharing with you the incredible journey that awaits within the pages of Lost Souls Recovered. This tale of resilience and determination will transport you to a time when freedom was a precious dream yet to be fully realized. Within the confines of a plantation, we meet 17-year-old John, a young man who knows no other life than the harsh reality of servitude. Despite the official end of slavery, its remnants persist and remain large, casting shadows over John's existence. But destiny weaves an unexpected path when the wife of the plantation owner passes away, forever altering the course of John's life. With fingers pointed his way, John makes the life-altering decision to flee, leaving his mother behind in a desperate bid for freedom. His journey takes him on a treacherous path down south, where he hopes to find a long-lost cousin and the promise of a bigger and better life. However, John's escape is far from straightforward. With the plantation owner shadowing him, John must outwit his relentless shadow at every turn. The stakes are high, and one wrong move could cost him his hard-won freedom and even his life. In Lost Souls Recovered, you will embark on an emotional roller coaster, traversing heart-wrenching loss, hard-earned victories, and the perpetual struggle for self-reinvention. John's battles are not only against the external forces that seek to subjugate him, but also the internal demons that threaten to engulf his very soul. During our time together this evening, I eagerly anticipate sharing insights into the well springs of inspiration that compelled me to pen this tale. I will illuminate the intricate tapestry of research and writing that brought this narrative to life, while also recounting the challenges and triumphs that punctuated the journey. Moreover, I'll offer you a tantalizing glimpse into my upcoming second book, an odyssey that charts the path of a blossoming author. I guess I'm blossoming in the realm of publishing. I eagerly anticipate your questions and wholeheartedly embrace the opportunity for meaningful discourse about the profound themes and captivating narrative woven within the fabric of Lost Souls Recovered. Together, let us embark on this illuminating exploration, forging a deeper understanding of John's remarkable odyssey and finding within it the wellspring of inspiration to ignite our own aspirations. All right, so again, hello, I'm Eric Walker. I am a debut author, and I really appreciate you for coming. And it's raining outside, so thank you for making the sacrifice in that regard. And we are online. This is being streamed by YouTube. So the people out there in YouTube land, thank you and welcome you for joining me today as I talk about my book. So I want to talk about first talk about some themes of my book, and I guess overall I want to talk about the demons. I don't know if you've had a chance to read Lost Souls Recovered, but a few demons I want to talk to you about that John experiences in 1888 as a young mixed African American man. And secondly, so we're going to talk about his mixed race ancestry, and we're going to talk about the encounters that he had with the plantation owner who eventually passes away. And we're going to talk about uh, her treatment of him and how she dies. And lastly, another demon that will haunt him for the rest of his life is the fact that he had to flee Richmond. So Anne Davis, or Anne Billingsley, because she was a slave and she was owned by a person by the name of John Billingsley. And the demon that he has is that John Billingsley, as I write in the story, never knew his father. So the backstory here in Lost Souls Recovered, when you read it, you'll find out that Anne, she had lost everything that she had ever had. She was a slave and she was married to a slave owner, and unfortunately, that slave owner was, as they say, sold down the river to a Kentucky plantation owner. And so she lost her husband, even though she had begged the plantation owner to never separate them, but he did because of commerce and he needed money. And so she had two twin daughters, and unfortunately, they died at a young age at that time of cholera. So Anne had nothing in the world. She had no father, no mother, no relatives. Her husband had gone, and her only biological children, the twins, were died of cholera. She took care of the other kids in the neighborhood because that's who she was, and she was that type of mother, but she had nothing and she felt desolate. So one day she just wanted to just die, just give up. All hope had vanished from her, it had evaporated. And while she was stewing, while she was in her misery, so to speak, in her slave cabin, along comes a gang of marauding white men. They marauded through the village and doing whatever they wanted to do. Now, this is in, I think this is just after slavery, as I recall in the book. But unfortunately for her, she's raped. And she is raped by several men, these marauders, as I say in the book. And she ultimately gives birth to my great grandfather. And John Billingsley, took the name of some plantation owner, never knew who his father was. So this is a time period when John was actually born in, that's his real name, my great grandfather, was born in 1870. And so he was born in 1870, he actually lived, I think it's 1950. But growing up as a mixed race person, he actually looked black and he identified himself as black, but he never knew his father. And the fact that, not that his father died in a car accident or a pony accident, whatever it would be at the time, but he never knew his father. And so it could be one of many people, and that's the demon that runs with him throughout this story. In today's age, we talk about reproductive health, for instance, and women's rights and abortion or whatever. But obviously, that was not an issue at that time. But Anne did not know what to do with her pregnancy of this life that was inside of her. So she decides, well, there's no decision about it, but she ultimately had this child by the name of John Billingsley. So he has to grow up without a father, and his mother, in a sense, becomes the father and tries to teach John, but she's not a man, so she can only do what her mother could do to try to raise him as best as she can. So that's one demon that John has to deal with. Having a father whom he knows nothing about, and it's impossible to know about because it could be one of many men. A second demon that he's going to encounter, as I mentioned, is a second demon that he has and possesses with him in him is the fact that he had this encounter with a plantation owner, the mistress of a plantation owner. And when John was 14, the woman by the name of Anne Billingsley was very wealthy, and her husband was wealthy, I should say. And because her husband was having these assassinations or trysts, as I call them in the book, she wanted to strike out against her own husband. He was doing it. Why couldn't she? John was an easy target, so she decided to one day go by the invite him to a rose bush and took advantage of him, and something that he will never forget. That stays with him for the rest of his life. But the interesting thing about this is this woman, Laura Billingsley, again, the mistress, the wife of the plantation owner, very wealthy, and John called her Madame Billingsley and the plantation owner Monsieur Billingsley because they would vacation in France and Europe, and John was a quick study, and so he began to address them as Monsieur Billingsley and Madame Billingsley, and so he learned French, and he was, as I said, he was a quick study, and eventually he developed the ability to read and write well. So while he hates her, it's kind of a dichotomy here because of what she did to him sexually, he also has to accept the truth because he is who he is because he's a quick study and he learned the language, both the English language and the French language, by being a servant in the house of the Billingsleys. So as the story starts out, John Billingsley is 17 years old and he's a servant. He's a house servant. And they appreciate him, especially Mr. Billingsley or Monsieur Billingsley, more so than Madame Billingsley. So that's the second demon that he has to deal with, the fact that he has this white hot hatred of her, yet he is becoming who he is because being in the house, he hears the way that she talks, the way they talk. So he's learning these things are accreting in his mind. And the last demon that I want to talk about in terms of a theme is the fact that, as I said, John was born to Anne Billingsley, and that's all she has in the world. No one else. Again, no parents, no cousins. She knows no one. But to make it an interesting story, and this is true, this is, and we'll talk about that, a true story, he eventually has to flee Richmond, Virginia, because fingers are going to be pointing his way. So he has to make the gut wrenching decision to leave Richmond, and by doing that, he leaves his mother behind, all that he knows in the world. She's heartbroken. So she tries to figure out how to deal with this tough decision that she died once when her husband was sold down the river. Then she died again when her twin daughters died of cholera. And now her only person that she knows in the world that's related to her by blood, her son, John Billingsley, is about to leave her because fingers were going to be pointed his way. So he, in fact, makes that a gut wrenching decision to leave Richmond, Virginia, and on a hope and a prayer, wing and a prayer, I suppose, he's thinking that someday at 17, he doesn't know when, he'll be able to return to Richmond to see his mother. His mother gives him only one instruction. He says, okay, son, if you gotta go, try to find a cousin, and she gives him the name of the cousin, very vague, a cousin Riley, cousin Riley. That's all she knows. And he's in this small village in Mount Hope. She doesn't, well, that's what she thinks. He's in this small village in Mount Hope. So he's going there to try to fulfill this promise. And he's fleeing the plantation because he knows that the plantation owner and his henchmen are probably shadowing him because fingers, again, as I said, have been pointed his way and suggestions that he has something to do with her death. So he leaves and he questions whether he's going to ever get back to see his mother. Now, this is a quest narrative in terms of it's an odyssey, I suppose, because the book goes from 1887 when it starts out in the Billingsley mansion, but there's some backstory prior to that, and it ends in 1928, I believe. So there is a 41-year time period, and you can see what all the times that I set forth in the book as to how challenging it is for him to try to overcome his demons that he himself would admit were self-inflicted. Not always, but somewhat self-inflicted. Particularly what happened to the plantation owner's wife. So, what inspired me to write Lost Souls Recovered? Well, as a person who's always had this novel kicking around in my head, I wanted to write a novel, and I wanted to write historical fiction based on the things I heard in my family because I grew up knowing very little about my family, but I began to ask questions. And the more I asked questions, I said, I have to try to bring this story to life. And so, as an African American author, a lot of our stories are taught to us or passed down through orature. meaning that it's just something that was told to you and it's passed down from one generation to another generation, not necessarily in writing per se, but it's one of those stories that if it's told so many times, it becomes true. And so I said I needed to write this story because I'm inspired by it, and I'll talk about that. Then I realized that the most effective way to destroy a person is to deny and obliterate their understanding of their own history. That's an extremely powerful statement, I thought. So I wanted to write a story that people will know about their history. So even though this is my story, you all have your own story. You all have your own ancestry. Whether your ancestry is in writing through a development of years of documents or orally, please be inspired. I hope that you'll be able to tell your story so that your history will not be obliterated. But for me, as an African American man, I did not want anyone to destroy me by trying to deny my history and to obliterate my history. So this is my opportunity to tell people about my story. There was a question about this nice lady asked me about my handle for my Facebook and Instagram and TikTok page. It's called Senaki Time. And that's SENNACHIE, then time, TYME. I had a little different twist on it. I guess that's called a metaplasm where you transfer or change the name of the word. So it's Senaki Time. So what is a Senaki? And I learned this and I said, it's about a storyteller. I'll give you a little bit more definition here, but essentially is a storyteller who is able to tell a story based upon what he has learned and what she has. Well, since it's Scottish, since it's ancient, it's typically men who would tell these stories. So I adopted that name, Senaki Time, and according to a nice definition of a Senaki is this: a Senaki is a traditional Scottish Gaelic storyteller or bard. The role of a Senaki was to preserve and recount the history, genealogy, legends, and folklore of the Scottish clans and communities through oral traditions. Senakis held an esteemed position within their communities as they were responsible for passing down cultural knowledge from one generation to the next. Their storytelling skills were highly valued, and they played an important role in maintaining the cultural identity and heritage of the Scottish people. I said, wow, it's perfect. I want people to uh, consider me a Sanaki, although this is just my first book, but I have a lot more in me, I think, to be able to tell more important stories. And we'll talk about the second book that I'm also working on right now. So long ago, how many of you remember the movie Roots? Yeah, everyone remember the movie Roots, right? All hands go up. So I wanted to be something like Alex Haley. And of course, Roots is fiction, but it's in a compelling story. And Alex Haley was able to, according to the book, he was able to find, or excuse me, there was a scene where he was able to find a slave manifest, if I have this correctly. And that slave manifest was had the name of Kunta Kinte on it. And Kunta Kinte had come over to the United States on a slave ship, I think through the transatlantic slave trade. And so he had found this manifest and he was able to go to West Africa to find out where Kunta Kinte, or later became Toby, had come from. I said, well, I'm going to do that. I'm going to set out to see if I can find a slave manifest to see from my African ancestry, if is there a slave manifest? Well, I had high hopes and they were quickly dashed. That did not come about because in my research, I found out there were, like in the censuses, you may know this, in 1860, Blacks were not counted in the census. That did not come until we had the so-called, well, the Reconstruction amendments, like in 1870 when the Blacks were citizens. Prior to that, Blacks were not citizens and they were considered 3/5 of a person for tax purposes and representation. So what I decided to do is, looking at the 1860 census, I would see periodically, and other documents, by the way, that there were some slave manifests out there. There were some documents out there that actually mentioned the names of slaves. But one of the things they did not mention was the slave's surname. And even if they mentioned a slave's name, it was not, it was like a nickname or some other moniker. So that was not very helpful to me in trying to find out, am I going to find the slave manifest? So what I did was, okay, let's go with the fact that in 1870, by the Constitution, it is required that there be a census conducted every 10 years. You probably know that probably until recently, I suppose, you probably received a knock on the door or whatever, and they're saying, hey, who lives here and that sort of thing. Now, I guess it's all computerized. But in 1870, Blacks were now counted as people and their names were in the census. It's okay. Let me go on to Ancestry and see if Ancestry.com, and see if I can find the names of my ancestors in 1870. So I did. And lo and behold, after some research, I was able to find, at least on my father's side as an example, I was able to go back to 1820, only because what I did is I used the age of the person in 1870 and subtracted how old he would have been. And so it says that, for instance, 1870, whatever year it was, I said this person was born in 1820. On my mother's side, I was able to go back to 1834. So the story that I tell in Lost Souls Recovered is on my paternal side, my maternal side, my mother's side, which is the Davis family. And again, remember, we're talking about the Billingsleys, and later John finds a way how he's going to become a Davis, and that's set forth in the book. So in talking to some ancestors, and I'm glad I did this many, many years ago. I think this probably goes back to the late 90s, and some of them have since passed away. And they were telling me how they met John Davis. And when I was talking to these relatives who have since passed away, they were like in their 80s and 90s. And so I'm glad I was able to get to them before they passed away. And one person in particular, we talked by phone had many sessions with her, and she said that she was telling me a story about John Davis. And one thing that she remembered was told to her was John Davis, and again, John Billingsly in the book later becomes Davis, but she said that Grandpa John, as she called him, he was very reluctant to talk about what he experienced in Reconstruction area. You may be familiar with the fact that if you've been in war or have a veterans are very reluctant for some reason to close up, and they won't talk about their experience. So Grandpa John, as my relative told me, was the same way. But one of the things that she said that he had told her as a young person when he was alive, John Davis was alive at that point, was that he was born in Richmond and that he got into some trouble. And the trouble was, she didn't explain the trouble per se, but she said that he had knocked down the mistress, is the exact word that she used, of the plantation. And so he had to flee. And she further said that in fleeing, he would find fruit and melons and different kinds of things to eat along the way. That's all I had. So I took that kernel of knowledge that she had given me, and that's how I developed the story about John being born in Richmond, and he has to flee. I invent a story as to the reason why he has to flee, because the plantation owner's wife passes away, and again, fingers were going to be pointed at him. He's a young man. He's got his whole life ahead of him, so he can stay, but in that environment, the outcome probably would not have been good. It was probably preordained that he be put to death by being accused, even if he didn't do it, which he didn't, by being accused of causing the death of a wealthy plantation owner. So I took this story and I said, I'm going to make it work. One other thing I want to add to this is, for me as an African American author, when I was growing up, I knew about Europe and I knew about Africa. And I would hear people say, I went to a predominantly white Catholic high school, and we would have things like Italian village festival or Oktoberfest and things like that, all wonderful. But I'm looking at that, I'm saying, if you have German Oktoberfest, that's German derivation, right? And so that gave you an understanding of your German roots, whether you were Italian, whether you're Polish, whatever you are, and if you're a European, you had that identity. Whereas if your ancestors were from Africa, well, Africa today, I can't proclaim to know how many countries there were in the 1800s, for instance, but I know today there are 54 countries. If I were to ask you where you're from, and you say you're from Europe, what? That Europe has how many dialects, how many languages, how many cultures, how many cuisines, how many this and that. So it's more confined if you say that you're from England or France or Germany or Lithuania, whatever. but you're saying you're from Africa. Well, Africa is also a country of about 50 plus countries. So I wanted to try to explore if I could find out exactly from whence I had come in part of Africa, because I wanted to have a meaning. So, being an African American man, I did not have the identity of a particular country. Like today, we see through immigration, we see a lot of Africans, whether they're from Somalia, Ethiopia, or whatever, they are first generation people. They have that connection that I didn't have and never will have. So I wanted to find out if I could make that connection to, because a lot of the slave trade at that time came from, I think, Senegal and Gambia and some of the Western African countries, but I was still not able to make that country. So we African Americans, for instance, we talk about soul food. Well, that's an experience that was developed after slaves had been here and we found a way to make dishes work, and eventually we called it soul food. But that's a uniquely American experience. Whereas if you were born in Europe and your ancestor taught you how to cook sauerkraut, I don't know, whatever it is from where you were in Europe, that is from, where you from whence you came, because that was something that was unique to you, which I did not have. So that's what inspired me to write the book. I wanted to make a difference, put in my 2 cents so that it will be in the world forever, long after I'm gone, of course, and for my family to understand that. Understand that you need to ask questions about your ancestor, because if you don't, you should know your own history, because past is prologue. Do not allow anyone to tell you something that you are not. And the best way to know who you are is to understand your own history and share it with others. So, in researching my book, let's turn to the research of the book. There are scenes in Richmond, Virginia, specifically the Tredegar Iron Works Company. I went to Richmond, Virginia, and studied Tredegar Irons. Tredegar Irons is a Scottish, well, I didn't think about this, but it's a Scottish-based company, and it was an ironworks company, and they supplied material and ordnances to the Confederacy. So the owner of, John Billingsley, again, who owned this huge mansion, he had contracts with Tredegar Iron, and that's how he became wealthy. And so I wanted to go there and see it for myself. Now, the factory or the ironworks is no longer there. However, I was able to see the structure, the remnants of the structure of Tredegar Ironworks, and I was able to read some literature that they had there and talk to the docents or people who were quite knowledgeable about Tredegar. So the way I describe things in the book is largely based on what I observed at the site itself, as well as talking to people and doing other kinds of research. I also traveled to Birmingham, Alabama. So my book, Lost Souls Recovered, there are a number of major cities where I discuss in detail about the landscape, the vista of these cities. So besides Richmond, Virginia, there is a major stop in several major stops, but I'm mentioning Birmingham because he had a stop. He, being the young protagonist, had a stop in Birmingham where he had to go to Sloss, S-L-O-S, Furnace is the name of the company. And Sloss was a big company in Birmingham in the late 1880s and early 1900s. And so there was a scene where the protagonist comes together with the antagonist, the owner, and having something, this is many years later, well, maybe 3 or 4 years later, and there is a scene, a confrontation as to whether he's going to be able to convince or get John Billingsley or John Billingsley to tell him what actually happened. But I mentioned Sloss Factory because there is a very confrontational scene in Sloss Furnace where there is a confrontation, and I needed to visualize what this furnace place would look like so I can build the story around the confrontation. So as part of my research, I did what I wanted, what I needed to do. Now, I recently had an opportunity to attend a book signing and a book discussion. I'm sure all of you have heard of this guy, David Gran. Yeah, he wrote The Wager. Anyway, and he was on 60 Minutes, if you don't know if you knew that. So I saw him on 60 Minutes. I went to the book signing. He was at Westerville Public Library. And I say that, and I'm mentioning his name, David Gran, Grann, because he went to Brazil and he took these ships and voyages to actually try to walk in the places where the ships would have taken place and where these ship voyages would have occurred in the 1770s. Now, I didn't go on any seafaring adventures. My feet were always planted on the ground, but I did do some type of research. I like to next talk about the book publishing process. So this was my first time writing a book, and I didn't know what I was doing. And once I realized what I needed to do by doing a lot of research in terms of reading lots of other historical fiction books, knowing how to write dialogue tags, and I had gotten all kinds of books about the anatomy of how to write a good book, best-selling books, and blah blah blah. I had a whole library of books in my bookshelf telling me how to write a book, and this is what you should do and what you shouldn't do. So after I had gotten my first draft done, I hated it. I think a lot of authors will confess that this is fit for file 13, just put in the trash can. And I left it alone for a while because I could not stand it. And eventually I said, I got to get back to the story. If I don't tell it, no one will tell it. So I got back to the story and I did more research and I said, I put out several more drafts. And then this is probably 15 years ago. That's how long it's been. And then, life interrupts, some issues come up, and then I put it down again. And then I said, boy, this is the second time I put it down for a few years, and it's getting lost. If I don't do anything about it, it's not going to move in the direction that I wanted it to move, that it needed to move, quite frankly. So I picked it up again, and I started sending it out to an editor. And this was obviously well before Chat GPT and all of the great software that we have today that writers can use or anyone can use to help with the writing. So I sent it by, I think I actually sent it, it was about a 3 or 4 inch notebook that I sent out that way. I don't think I sent it by email, but I think, no, the editor requested a hard copy. So I put a hard copy in the mail and sent it to the editor. And the editor sent it to Texas and she made some edits and eventually got it back and went back and forth. And I said, okay, eventually I've got to get this book out. So I decided to do more research to determine how or what type of publisher I was going to use. And I was anxious to get it out because it was already sitting for so long. And as you may know, in terms of the book publishing process, there are a few ways that you can go. We all know about traditional publishing, right? And when we think of traditional publishing, we typically think of the so-called Big Five, Random House, Penguin, um, Macmillan, those sort of companies. And with a traditional publisher, you have to acquire an agent. And an agent will work with the publisher to see if there can be a connection that you can be retained ultimately by the publisher. But the hard part is getting an agent. And then if you get an agent, then you got to get a publisher. Then you're on your way. Well, you may know with traditional publishing, it takes a long time for the point, even if they accept your book, to it becoming a publication. So I didn't want to wait that long. I had already waited too long, and I said, well, let me try something else. Then on the complete opposite of traditional publishing is self-publishing, which a lot of people do. And that's fine. And you're on your own because you don't have the help of a professional person. But money is involved, and so you may not be able to hire what I'm going to call a hybrid publisher, which I'll talk about here in a second. So you go with self-publishing, you're responsible for your own book design, your own book cover, you're responsible for your own editing, so a whole bunch of a la carte type issues that you have to be involved with when you are self-publishing a book. And so I said, well, I don't have time for this. I need some help. Uh, and so I decided to go in the middle, which is called hybrid publishing for this particular book. I didn't have to wait the 2 years or so, 18 months, whatever, if I was lucky to get an agent and a publisher. And I didn't want to do this by myself by doing self-publishing. So I went with a hybrid publisher. And in doing that, I learned that I was able to find a hybrid publisher who had, well, first of all, a hybrid publisher is simply a blending, a melding of the two between traditional publishing and self-publishing. And so with hybrid publishing, it's different from so-called, you may have heard this term, vanity books. And I hate that term, but the traditional publishers in the book industry say a book is vanity published because you're doing it for vain reasons and you're just doing it without the help of the professionals who really know how to write a book. So with traditional publishing, one of the things that was very important to me as a writer, because I do like to write, was to make sure it was a story that I can tell in an easy way. So with Hybrid Publisher, they followed the publishing standards of traditional publishers, where if your book is self-published, then it's no guarantee that you're going to follow the standards that the traditional publishers put out. And why is this important? And why was it important to me? I lucked into it. I didn't realize this, but if you are self-published and you want to get your book out there to various libraries, they will tell you libraries won't take a self-published book for the most part. They just won't, because librarians are like everyone else in the book industry. They're professional people, and they believe that if your book is professionally edited, then it's probably going to be a good book, and they will trust the fact that it's been professionally edited by someone who meets the traditional publishing standards. So with the hybrid publishing, I went with that route because I wanted my book to be distributed to many libraries. As an example, my book is here and available at the Billingsly Library, as well as several libraries in Ohio. Now, and other states, quite frankly. And the disadvantage, however, of hybrid publishing as compared vis-a-vis traditional publishing is with traditional publishing, they have these huge distribution networks and they pay for it. And they have the power, the volume to push out these books to all these libraries. And they have the money and they can do that, especially if they believe it's a book worth doing. They'll spend the money. Well, eventually you have to earn it back, but they will push your book out there. For me, as someone who is a hybrid publisher, I had one thing going for me is that my book was met the high editorial standards, writing standards, and so that helped me immensely. And not only that, if you see some of the reviews over there, I got great reviews by Kirkus. Kirkus is one of the gold standards that people use, writers use to promote their book. And so I said, wow, thank you, Kirkus, gave me this great book review. And so as an example, uh, a lot of my story takes place in a rural county, rural municipality or township, quite frankly, of Mount Hope, Alabama. And so I wanted my book to be there. And the guy that I talked to, the librarian, said, well, has it been reviewed by Kirkus? Now, at that point, or professional reviewers, Library Science, Library Journal, Kirkus Publishers Weekly, as an example, are some of the reviewers that libraries in particular consider when determining whether they're going to order your book and purchase it. Okay. Oh, okay, you told us. So yeah. So at that time, my book came out in October of 2022, so last October. And when my book came out, I had not yet had the Kirkus review. And I think I'm going to show you something. If let's see if I have it over here. Yes. Okay. Well, yes, I do have a sticker from Reader's Review. What I want to show you, though, is not that it's a big difference, but when my book first came up by my publisher, you can see this is the hardcover version. And this is what I particularly like about the book is that this image here is the same on the jacket. But when my book first came out, was published, I did not have the Kirkus review. And if when you read a book, particularly a traditional publisher, why does it take so long for a book to come out from a traditional publisher? It takes, even after the book is finished, it can take 6 months to a year perhaps for it to come out. Why? They are getting all the reviews from the the reviewers, and those reviews can take, as in my instance, like 3 to 4 months before it actually comes out. And they need to also rely on other authors to write a review. So they put a review on the book. So there's no Kirkus review on this book. So what I had to do after I finally got my nice review is the publisher put out another version of the book. This time it has the review on it. And so that was quite pleasing to me, and it's here as well. And it says, an expertly told tale of love, loss, and second chances. So what did I learn from that? I learned that before the book is published, get your reviews in. So you won't have to have a second publishing that contains the review. Okay, so I want to talk about also, because this is kind of a takeoff of, well, it is. It's based on large, small piece based upon my second book. And I'd like to know what you think about my second book right now. And I was explaining some of this to Whitney. Okay, so in Lost Souls Recovered, what I did was I took a snippet, just a tittle part of the book, and I said, I'm going to see if I can make this work. In the Lost Souls Recovered, there is a scene where one of my relatives is his land is stolen. And one of the things that we had knew, and I had known growing up, my father would tell me is that what happened to all this land that we once had? Well, how many of you have heard of Bruce's Beach? Okay, 19. Okay, Bruce's Beach was it came out. The story came out in October of 21, I think. And at that time, Bruce Beach was an African American man in California, and in 1912, he had purchased all this property for blacks to be able to go to the beach and celebrate because they were not welcome even in California at the white beaches. So in the 1920s, the city of Manhattan, California, under the guise or pretext of eminent domain, took his land and they gave him a penance for it. So I mentioned October of 21, I think it was. At that time, finally, after all these years, there was Governor Newsom signed legislation that was approved by the state of California. So said, hey, this land was taken wrongly from the Bruce Beach family, and we're going to give it back because, quite frankly, it was racism and it should not have been taken. So this was an issue dealing with governmental property where, excuse me, where the government is involved. The government can, in fact, use its legislative authority to give back land that, in this case, was wrongfully taken. In my case, I'm arguing that the land was taken from my great great grandfather through force or intimidation. I'm working on my second book, and that land that was taken did not involve the government, so it's harder. What it involved was a white man, as an example, in 1888, I think I say, he stole the land, he took the land and killed my great grandfather. His name is Tony Hawkins. And then on that land, because it was coveted land, he built a dry goods store called Thornsbury Dry Goods Store. So this is over 140 years ago. So if I get this book out, let's say in 24, 25, whenever it comes out, you're looking close to 150 years later. That dry goods store on the small property in Mount Hope, Alabama, has morphed into over 340 supermarkets. And so the protagonist in my book, which tentatively I'm calling In the Belly of the Beast, he's a 22-year-old young man who is a Yale University graduate with a degree in molecular biology. But his trajectory in life was always he was going to be the best at whatever he could do. He was going to be a physician, and he was going to be this and that. He's going to win the Nobel Peace Prize. That's how smart he was. But in listening to his father talk about this land that was stolen, he decides to, after graduation, to take a gap year before going to medical school because he's having these recurring dreams that he had gone to boarding schools and he had vacation in St. Moritz and Monaco and all of that. And he did not really know his black side of the family. His mother's white, his father's a black physician, his mother's a nurse from Scotland of all places, the mother. Okay, there's a Scottish theme going on here. I didn't realize that. Okay, so he has to really figure out what he's going to do with his life rather than, well, you know, when you write a novel, things have got to change. And so it's not going to be easy for him. So he now has to realize the person he's going up against is named Cecil or Cecil Thornsbury V. The person who owns the dry goods store in 1888 or so, who stole the land from my great grandfather, uh, in 1888 was, I call him Papa Thornsbury. And so he started the dry goods store. Then there's a Cecil Thornsbury, the second, third, fourth, and fifth. Okay, and so then the fifth, which takes place in current times, Cecil the fifth, he's the CEO of the privately held Thornsbury Supermarket. Again, it's a regional chain, but there are 340 such supermarkets in the South. So this protagonist, I call him Sebastian in the book, he is disturbed by the fact that this land was stolen, and he really can't do anything about it until he starts investigating, like I'm doing research and finding out was that land really stolen. So his task in the belly of the beast is to go into the belly of the beast and see if there's some way in which he can bring down this mogul who has a phalanx of investigators, a henchman, and lawyers, and he is 22 years old, naive, and this has a 19-year-old female sidekick, and the two of them are going to see if they can bring this company down to its knees, a company that hires thousands of people. And so there's a conflict there as to if he's going to bring them down. These people, these supermarket employees from the top to the bottom, are going to, they need their jobs. So that's my second book, In the Belly of the Beast. I was thinking about calling it Redemption, but I'm working on that book. So my first book, Lost Souls Recovered, is a historical fiction by all means. The second book is an action thriller, and it kind of reminds me of like National Treasure with Nicolas Cage. And I'm trying to do like the impossible. How is this guy going to do this or get into the White House or whatever, Nicolas Cage? And how is this 22-year-old man going to bring down a man who's a billionaire who lives in an 8,000 square foot house and who has henchmen and lawyers and is protected? So I got to figure out to make it work. And of course, with a character arc, you have to make sure that he has one assumption in life, but that's going to be tested many times in my second book, again, tentatively titled In the Belly of the Beast. So that's all that I have. I want to thank you for being here. And like I said, you have any questions for me? I'd be glad to answer any. Well, you can follow me on Instagram. Okay, it's a question. Yes, sure.
What's your writing process? How do you make time for writing? Because this is a lot of writing. And I'm just curious, like when you started, how long it took. Do you write on the weekends?
Yes. I have no life.
You have no life.
No, I'm sorry. Yes. I've been an attorney for a number of years, but you have to make time for it. And this, hopefully what you understand from listening to me talk about Lost Souls Recovered, it was my baby. I had to give birth to it. And so I made time when I wasn't working my day job, so to speak. I would go home and write. I mentioned that I had a whole bunch of books that I had gotten from Amazon or the library, and I had bookcases of books in the set, and I would have posters everywhere all over my house, and I made time to do it. I had to do it. Now that my second book is much easier to write so far because I know the process. I just get out there and bang away at the computer. Now, just like my first book, I hated my first draft. So far, I'm hating my second draft because with a thriller, an action thriller, you need a lot of thrills. You need a lot of action. You need car crashes. There won't be necessarily car crashes in my case, but you need people to go to jail. You need people to die. And so that's what goes into an action thriller. So I'm hoping to make that work. I do believe it has great potential, the second book, probably more so than my first book, because now that I know what I'm doing, but I've never written an action thriller, but I think I have the hang of it. I think I know what to do. So how do I make time? Just for the Lost Souls Recovered, I think I started probably 15, if not 15 plus years ago. And I put it down though for a while because I hated it. I didn't think I was good enough. I didn't know what I was doing. I said, okay, writing a brief or writing something as an attorney is boring, quite frankly. Creative writing is what I really like to do. And so I said, I'm going to make this work. I could not necessarily borrow on my attorney skills as a writer. I had to borrow on the skills of other writers. So I read probably 10 to 12 books, mostly historical fiction, to see how they wrote and see how engaging they were with their story. So, and I do believe in my particular book, Lost Souls Recovered, there are a lot of great engaging scenes and a lot of themes too that I think will resonate with people.
So which books did you find were the most helpful or inspiring for you when you were doing your research
Right.
for this, and even action books too now for your current book?
Let me start with the second one in terms of action books. And one of the things I learned in terms of writing a book like an action book, I said, let me go to a best-selling author. In this case, I went to, have you heard of Harlan Coben? Okay, I'm not going to put down Harlan Coben, but I recently read The Match and I Will Find You. Those are two recent books that he put out as an example. And lots of action in it. And I really dinged it on Amazon and Goodreads because a lot of people confirmed me that to me, it was just because he's so famous and he was so good at the beginning, you can just put out work and you still be. Here's the thing: once you're a best-selling author, you're always a best-selling author. And so, best-selling author simply means that you sell books. Doesn't necessarily attest to how well you write, but the fact that you sell books. So I read his books, and in his books, there are a lot of car crashes and a lot of action, fast paced. And as opposed to historical fiction, most of it is based on character development. I think if you read my book, Lost Souls Recovered, you'll see how well developed the characters are. With an action book, it's more plot driven because you have to move things along. And that's what Harlan Coben, a great writer, I'm just saying that he's written several books as an example, but I use those as a template to say, because I had never written an action thriller. I wanted to use him as an example how to what to look for in writing a book. And with respect to historical fiction, I would read things like John Jakes, for instance, and what you know, if you ever write a book, they tell you to look for books that are similar to your book. So I went with respect to Lost Souls Recovered, which is post early Reconstruction. I went to books like Lolita Tatamy as an example. She wrote Cane River and Red River, and I liked the way that she told her story. And there were others that I can't think of now, but I would find other books. I'll find books in the historical fiction genre and read them, and I would highlight them and they were tagged and all of that, and I would steal some things from them. What did Picasso say? Picasso said that good artists paint, great artists steal, or something like that. So I decided to, I have to make it my own. I won't be guilty of plagiarism, but that's it, man. Because there's really little original thought. If you think you thought of it, believe me, someone else has thought of it before you. And so I would then use what other people used and make it my own work, cook it up and make it work for myself. Yeah. So, any other questions? Well, again, I do thank you for being here today. And as Whitney said, this is my first library appearance. I have more coming up, and I will be appearing at the Columbus Book Festival, which is set for the 15th and 16th. I will be one of 3 historical fiction authors on the panel. They're discussing historical fiction, as Whitney said, what it takes to write historical fiction. So if you like books, if you just want to go downtown to the Columbus Metropolitan Library, it's a beautiful library. I was there for a while, and I just stopped by and you'll meet a lot of nice authors.
Okay.
And the library's not closed.
Well, thank you so much, Eric. Thanks for sharing your time with us.
Perfect time, about an hour. Well, thank you all for coming.
Yeah, thanks.
I appreciate it. Yeah, follow me on TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook, and you'll see my work there. You can.